Hello and welcome back to Vox Terra. Today, Henry Kissinger dies at 100. Now, many of our media pundits, politicians, laud him as a great statesman, while others still point out his alleged war crimes and overlooking human rights abuses. But then others will justify that as he was doing it all in the American interest. Well, our media facilitates that narrative that it was done in the American interest. One, because the American interest is rarely ever defined. The business interests that are at play in many of these war crimes or human rights abuses are overlooked. The victims of these war crimes or human rights abuses, when they're happening by, quote, our side, close quote, are rarely humanized. And this lack of humanization, this lack of emphasis, means our public remains what might seem apathetic. And there is a massive double standard that I hope becomes clear to you as we go through this story. Well, citing the AFP, a recent article I believe published on December 1st, if I'm correct, but I'll post a link to it. One of these supports where Henry Kissinger was looking the other way at human rights abuses, or worse, even supporting them, was his support for the coup in Chile, the coup of 1973, that deposed democratically elected socialist Salvador Allende. Now, when I was much younger, I'd watched a documentary, I should say, called Controlling Interest. And that documentary painted the picture that this coup to oust democratically elected Salvador Allende, which culminated in his murder, please know, was really done, or at the heart of it, was because his socialist policies were running afoul of various multinational business interests. Specifically, the mining industry, the copper mining industry. Apparently, a lot of the copper mines of Chile were owned by multinationals headquartered in the US of A. One of them, if I remember correctly, was called Anaconda Copper. Now, the Jacobin magazine, in their article From the War Room to the Boardroom, highlights other business interests that Kissinger supported, including the arms industry and sales to, I believe, Saudi Arabia and Iran when they were under our sphere, our in quote sphere. And they also interestingly listed ITT and PepsiCo as beneficiaries of getting rid of socialist Salvador Allende in Chile. So Allende was elected in 1970, and he started going forward with plans and did nationalize that copper mining industry. Well, according to Wikipedia, because I just want to refresh it a bit, he believed those companies had been taking what he called excess profits from Chile, and therefore they weren't owed full book value for this nationalization, but we're going to get a much smaller compensation package. Well, now going back to that AFP article again, Kissinger is quoted, and I also heard this in Democracy Now!, as addressing something in the US called the 40 Committee, which was a committee that had a multi-agency committee that had the ability to authorize covert actions. By covert actions, I believe we're talking about things like coups or quiet interventions. Kissinger there was quoted as saying when they elected Salvador Allende, "I don't see why we need to stand by and watch a country go communist due to the irresponsibility of its own people." I just felt like doing that voice. That's kind of what he sounded like. And really amazingly, it was just this past summer where more came out about that coup. More was declassified by our government. Ours, I mean the American government. And that really tells you how long it can take for this stuff ever to make the news. So according to that AFP article, Kissinger oversaw operations to prevent Allende from getting elected in the first place. One of those they cited was the attempted kidnapping of the Army Commander-in-Chief, General Rene Schneider. Schneider resisted, opening fire to defend himself, and was shot dead. Now, once he took power, I remember on interviews from Democracy Now! That there was a lot of attempts made then by us under Kissinger, to sabotage the Chilean economy, to make Allende and those socialists look bad. Well, that should sound familiar to you. Doesn't that still go on today? The 1973 coup brought Augusto Pinochet to power. Augusto Pinochet is infamous as being a bloody dictator. Allende was killed in that coup, as were many of Allende's supporters. Killed, murdered, disappeared, and tortured. Yet Kissinger supported that Pinochet, what we would call a regime, if the country was on our so-called enemy list. Interestingly, note how the media uses the term regime, where they do and where they don't. And considering how long it took for some of the truth about that coup to come out in the media, well, amigo, the moral there is when you are being told, hey, yeah, this is bloody what's happening, but we're the good guys, they're the bad guys. There's a lot more to the story that ain't coming out, and maybe we don't have to support such a bloody campaign, whatever the campaign may be. Well, regarding calling Kissinger a war criminal, that war criminal label often comes up in context of his orchestration for the carpet bombings of Cambodia and Laos. What was happening there is Richard Nixon came in wanting to get out of the Vietnam War, but he wanted to get out in such ways to extract what's called maximum concessions from North Vietnam, or the Communist Socialist Vietnam. And this year I'm largely citing to another Jacobin article, Kissinger in Cambodia, as well as other sources, including Democracy Now! Well, for whatever reasons, increasing bombing of the North might not work because they're trying to negotiate to get out of the war, is what I'm assuming. But here, the communist Vietnamese were running supplies or staging attacks on the South Vietnamese government through the US-backed South Vietnamese government through Laos and Cambodia. Now, prior to Nixon, prior to Kissinger, our, meaning the US's, bombing of Cambodia at least was more limited, more what we might consider commensurate, or what's the word, proportionate with the necessity of war. But Nixon and Kissinger agree because they want to extract those maximum concessions just to do a massive bombing campaign. And those bombs, I believe, included napalm, cluster bombs, as well as the defoliant agent, Agent Orange. And during this time period, I believe Kissinger was instrumental in orchestrating the coup of Cambodia's prince, who wanted to remain neutral, but for whatever reasons, he wanted to get him out. Well, this getting rid of the prince then drove the prince's supporters into the arms of the communist rebels, who were known as the Khmer Rouge. Also, this bombing, according to these reports, made the Khmer Rouge just blossom in numbers. Because think about what Cambodia was like prior to this bombing. A pastoral place, very rural, very what we might call non-developed. So to them, seeing B-52s or whatever kind of bombers were being used, dropping these explosions on them, it might have seemed no different to them than if it was just space aliens coming and zapping them with lasers. Very disorientating is what I mean. Creating the rise of extremism. Now, according to a historian I heard interviewed on Democracy Now!, even the Khmer Rouge rebels might not have got so extreme and may not have gone towards Pol Pot. He was one leader among others, had this bombing not occurred. Again, extremes lead to extremes. Now, regarding this bombing, Kissinger apparently even picked targets, and he was quoted as saying, to target anything that moves or flies. Well, that's pretty darn brutal. Now, once North Vietnam won and unified Vietnam under the socialist banner, Ho Chi Minh, they then had a rivalry with the Khmer Rouge. Now, I don't know if this rivalry stemmed from the fact that Khmer Rouge under Pol Pot was so brutal, and I've often heard the term genocidal used. There, I'm not sure. But here, during that rivalry, along comes Henry Kissinger again, and according to that Jacobin article, Kissinger felt as the grand chess master he imagined himself to be, and that many in the media also imagined him to be, that he could then play the Khmer Rouge against Vietnam. And he was quoted in 1975 as telling the Thai foreign minister that he, the Thai foreign minister, should, quote, also tells the Cambodians that we will be friends with them. They are murderous thugs, but we won't let that stand in our way. Now, I sounded less like Kissinger on that one, but you can't blame a guy for trying. Now, here that article also cites both U.S. and Chinese support for the Khmer Rouge against Vietnam, citing a rivalry between China and the Soviet Union as part of the factor in that, but also that Kissinger had been brokering relations with China. Now, please remember this much lauded détente with China and Nixon, which came about through the one China policy, meaning, hey guys, we'll say China and Taiwan, you're one country someday, which interestingly, that's been completely forgotten from the media narrative as we are stoking this new rivalry with China. But what really came out of that détente was the opening of Chinese markets to multinational foreign business interests. the opening of China as a source of inexpensive labor, and the opening of China as a place where you can do business without having to worry a whole heck of a lot about environmental regulations. Now, please note that some of the changes in China in recent years are that they are not as inexpensive as they used to be for labor, and they have been doing a lot of crackdowns on pollution. So consider, is that part of the reason why they're actually now on the bad guy list in our media, which is dominated largely by these multinational business interests? And the last article that I want to cite for you today is again from the Jacobin. It's called From the War Room to the Boardroom. Now, I did mention that at the outset, and it's not from the war room to the bedroom, but that would be an interesting article as well somebody could write, because apparently Kissinger was quite a playboy, even dating celebrities, leading the high life. Well, some of that occurred while he still worked for the State Department, but some of that lifestyle was probably facilitated by his opening after he left the State Department in 1977 of Kissinger and Associates. And in 1982, when Kissinger and Associates was formed, apparently there was also a big global banking crisis. A lot of nations going into default on their loans or at risk of it. So what was going on here was that the IMF, International Monetary Fund, in the US put together bailout packages for these countries like Mexico, and then the beneficiaries of the newly arranged loans would be multinational banks, often headquartered in the US, often clients of Kissinger and Associates, according to this article. Makes sense, though. Then we get to the 90s. The privatization wave, a massive privatization wave that Kissinger and Associates could help consult on, help broker deals for private interests to get into these newly privatized economies. Here I'm talking about the former socialist bloc. Because remember, when that Soviet Union was finally overthrown or dismantled, what really occurred was a big sale of all those public sector goods. One way you could look at that is, sorry, you the people of Russia or whatever country no longer own this. It's going to be sold off to cronies or who the heck ever. And during the 90s, according to this article, Kissinger and Associates would typically take a $200,000 annual retainer fee from their clients. And I want to point out his clients included banks, but also oil interests. So let's just wrap this show up now as best we can here. We look at this history of coups, covert actions, invasions. A lot of it I didn't have time to touch on. Deaths where people are not getting humanized, tortures. We tie that in with Kissinger and Associates and the consulting for these private multinational organizations. The allegations that to a degree that coup in Chile at least was done to protect certain multinational business interests. And what kind of picture does that really paint for you of the world we live in? What kind of picture does that paint for you of what I'm calling a double standard within our media? How when something goes wrong in one country, how it's, especially if they're a socialist or have a public sector economy, well, they're dumb, they're bad, they got bad policies, it's inherently evil. Whereas if there's murders or tortures or whatever under Augusto Pinochet, it's a fledgling democracy. That's what they used to call it in those days, or they're learning, but it's not pinned on, hey, that's inherent in capitalism. A built-in double standard in a media that's dominated by large business interests. And this spreading globally of privatization, is it really in the best interest of the American people? Well, one of the reasons I wanted to highlight for you that two of Kissinger's clients and Kissinger and Associates were banking interests and fossil fuel interests is because the two go hand in hand, contrary to the false conspiracy narratives which portray the banks as being behind a big green thing. They're not. They're the ones facilitating all this oil drilling. And when we consider now that we are stuck with this system of buy, sell, buy, need it or don't, that is pumping our planet full of greenhouse gases and carcinogens, our planet is heating as a result, the climate destabilizing, as well as the social sphere destabilizing, giving rise to ever more extremism. This, my friend, is not in the interest of the American people. And that's as best I can wrap up this video for you for today. And so, my friends, if you found this video interesting, good food for thought, please make sure you are subscribed to my channel. You're clicking that there notification bell. You're liking, you're commenting. I love constructive feedback on anything really related to this show. And you are joining, and thank you, my two patrons of Patreon, Bella Lugrussi and Environmental Coffee House. You're joining them. Become a Patreon also. This show is a heck of a lot of work, extremely time consuming, and that comes at a massive opportunity cost for me. And as always, mon frere, until next time, peace be with you.